Hey, welcome back. This is Dino, and in this mini lecture, we'll be discussing 70 Years of International Human Rights by Rhoda Howard Hessman. And the bigger point I want you to take away is that international human rights have truly had a global influence. In this article, Howard Hessman talks about this. International human rights have a relatively short history compared to the law as a whole. Their trajectory is quite short. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has only been celebrated. It was celebrated in 2018, so at that time there was 70th anniversaries. So again, not that seems like a long time to people who don't know law, but law's been around for so long that it's actually a pretty short time. And despite this, it has had international human rights have had a global influence. So the thrust of the article that Howard Hassman is trying to get across is that international human rights are both celebrated, but they're also opposed for various reasons, which we'll discuss. And this article chronicles its global history and as well as opposition to international human rights. As I just said, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was declared in 1948. It was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in December 10th of 1948. And it had its 70th anniversary in 2018. And from this, an enormous body of international human rights law has developed over that 70-year period of time. If you take it from the view of cultural imperialism, some non-Western countries believe that human rights is a form of Western cultural imperialism, and non-Western countries did not participate in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights draft, although non-Western countries were involved in the earliest, but they didn't actually participate in the draft writing. What the main critique from this related critique is that the way that they're focused on the individual, they promote excessive individualism, which can be conceived as being selfish. And critics believe that we should instead care for the family or community, not individuals in international human rights. For example, in the Western context, we have housing advocates, food bank workers, and volunteers who foster human rights on the ground. And in the U.S. and Canada, for example, we mostly individuals respect human rights and that our citizens follow laws for the most part. And that we do have a developed sense of community and a developed sense of care for each other. So that's good, and that sort of makes international human rights appealing. However, in non-democratic countries, they may have lower. They believe that international human rights are of lower importance, and because of this increases the needs for human rights protection from abusive governments in non-democratic countries. As a result, in total, human rights are irrelevant and ever evolving. There are some progress, but also challenges with respect to LGBTQ rights. In some countries, homosexuality is prohibited, such as Russia and countries within Africa and the Middle East. And as you probably know, some religious groups are homophobic. As a result of all of this, LGBTQ rights are difficult to measure internationally. And there is no LGBTQ rights declaration, but the UN is paying attention to this issue. So there's been progress, but also challenges with respect to collective rights. When you look at collective rights, it sort of defines as rights belong to groups of people as opposed to individuals. And as a result, one individual cannot exercise these rights if others who are similarly situated cannot exercise. For example, if you're an indigenous person, you should be able to exercise similar rights to other people in terms of indigenous rights. As a result of all of this, collective human rights has grown over the past 20 years. There's been progress and challenges with respect to indigenous rights. There was a new collective rights declaration, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that was passed in 2007. From it, it protects indigenous ways of life, languages, religions, cultures, and land bases. And the country of Canada, for example, in terms of its stance on this, it voted against UNDRIP, but reversed this by 2016. So there was some initial opposition, but it eventually was reversed. And it now it supports it. So as a result of all these progress and challenges, international human rights are both contracting or expanding depending on what issue specifically you're talking about. And this, again, also depends on the individual country and issue. For the most part, again, democratic nations seem to support the expansion of international human rights, while more authoritarian countries push back against that. Although, again, from the example of UNDRIP, even Canada has a checkered past with respect to some of these international human rights. Environmental rights have been looked at as and conceived of as a collective right. So that's the way they've been categorized, and they have global, for people who are advocates of environmental rights, they have global reach and impact. And these rights include a right to a clean and healthy environment. It also includes the right to protection against climate change that undermines livelihoods and well-being, as you've seen, people's lives being threatened if their place of work is under threat, or they've had to move, or they've had to become a refugee. So as a result, their work and their personal lives have been threatened. There's a right to peace, which is also a collective right. And this right, if it's defined as the right not to live in a state of war, it's a collective right. This right to peace is a collective right. For example, some examples of this are in war-torn countries in the Middle East and Africa as of 2018. And there's also a global fear of nuclear war. And I think the Russia and Ukraine conflict has underlined this nuclear threat more recently. In terms of environmental rights and right to peace, climate change and war create huge refugee problems, as I kind of I noted really briefly before about refugees. From climate change, there's an estimate that around 200 million climate refugees will flee rising sea levels by 2050. So that's not too far in the future. And in terms of war, refugees often will have to flee large-scale crime and war. One example would be the migrant caravan that tried to enter the U.S., and also obviously the movement out of Ukraine to neighboring countries like Poland from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. There's also economic rights in terms of international human rights, and they foster problems or create problems in terms of migration. For example, the United Nations Global Compact for Migration. This includes voluntary principles to save lives. It helps to ensure that successful migrant integration into new countries, and it helps foster attempts to prevent unduly burdening social infrastructure like healthcare. Because if there's too much migration that's in a rapid pace, it again can deeply impact the countries that are receiving these immigrants, such as, again, like Poland, for example, in the Ukraine-Russia conflict example, when a number of Ukrainians are leaving their home country to go to places like Poland. Economic development has been conceived as a collective right. There's a right to economic development. It's a collective right. There are various development activists who are trying to reduce poverty and inequality. And there's by many a goal of poverty reduction. There's been a great reduction in world poverty over the past 25 years. However, at the same time, inequality has been growing in most countries, as you've seen again, for example, during COVID-19, where some people were able to keep their jobs and do quite well. Other ones lost their jobs and suffered even more greatly than they were before. In terms of the future, there's a contrast between foreign aid and market economies. There's a push to attain economic human rights, and it's being easier to fulfill economic human rights. For example, rights to health, education, and housing. Those are somehow attainable. There is a conflict between foreign aid and market economies. Most change comes from the spread of market economies. Unfortunately, there's been very little change from foreign aid. So when countries adopt a market economy, again, that leads to things like poverty reduction. Foreign aid has been a mixed bag, and in fact, not as useful as many might think it has, but it should be. As a result, globalization has been a double-edged sword, both positive and negatives. Many people have benefited from globalization, while at the same time there's been job loss for industrial workers, especially in the West. And there's this loss of jobs, for example, has led to a anti-immigrant and xenophobic sentiments in many countries. Obviously, in terms of improving the positives and reducing the negatives, we have long-term goals. We want to control this terrible xenophobia. We also obviously want to reduce war, reduce crime, reduce economic negative impacts, and climate change migration. So that was Rhoda Howard Hassman, 7 years of international human rights. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.